The array was already running when she walked in. I want to be precise about that, because some of the later accounts have it wrong. The sequence in which things happen matters, and the sequence is what I logged. The Conclave biodiplomatic array was fully initialized at 0614 station time, 11 minutes before the human envoy entered the primary negotiation hall on Orvith Station. Every sensor was calibrated. Every baseline threshold was set. We had the biological signatures of the 3 Veth Choral senior negotiators, the 2 Aerith observers, and the Conclave commander, Tail Voris, on record before the session even opened. All of them registered exactly as expected. Elevated cortisol analogs, accelerated cardiovascular cycling, microtremor indices consistent with high-stakes diplomatic engagement. The hall carried 400 years of accumulated precedent for sessions like this one. Everyone in it knew what sessions like this one meant. The human envoy entered at 0625. She was carrying a paper notebook. Her name, for the record, was Coordinator Marin Solis. Middle career, according to the briefing file we had received. She had negotiated 17 territorial disputes prior to this posting, though none of those involved the survival of her species as a formal agenda item. She sat down, set the notebook flat on the table, and folded her hands on top of it. The array registered her arrival, ran the standard initialization sweep, and returned a biological profile. My junior monitor, Varel, looked at the readout and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Sir, the calibration may have slipped on the human sensor set." I leaned across and read it myself. Baseline. Every marker. Heart rate consistent with a being at rest. Skin conductance, the index we use as the primary anxiety correlate across 46 catalog species, negligible. Cortisol analog, baseline. Microtremor, none registered. Pupil dilation, within normal variation for ambient light levels. The Conclave biodiplomatic array had been in continuous operation for 230 years. It had supported 412 sessions. I had personally staffed 61 of them. In all of that time, with every species we had ever brought to a negotiation table, the opening sweep had never returned this. "Run the calibration sequence again," I said. It returned the same numbers. I flagged it and sent a brief note to Adjudicator Sarel in the monitoring director's seat above us. He read it without expression and wrote back 2 words, "Proceed carefully." 40 seconds later, he appeared at the bottom of the stairs and walked directly to my station. He did not say anything. He leaned over and looked at the readout himself, the way a senior official looks at something when they have learned not to trust summaries, and then straightened up and stood there with his arms at his sides. "Is it the array?" he said. "We've run 2 full calibrations. Backup system confirmed the same numbers." "Then what is it?" I did not have an answer for him yet. He went back upstairs. On the other side of the glass partition, Commander Tail Voris opened the session. Is built on a simple biological truth: all sentient species fear death. The fear of termination, individual termination, collective termination, the extinction of a species line, is the deepest, most universal pressure point we have ever found. It registers on our instruments as a cluster of physiological responses so consistent across species that we built our entire opening protocol around inducing and measuring it. You establish the credible threat of the worst possible outcome, and the body of the being across the table tells you how much of it they believe. The first escalation point in our standard protocol is what we call the statement of scope. Commander Voris delivered it at 0641. He laid out, in precise and formal terms, the breadth of Conclave military capability currently deployed in the outer approach corridors of the human home system. He did not threaten. He simply described. He listed tonnage, he listed range, he listed response timelines. The purpose of the statement of scope is not coercion, it is calibration. It is the moment when the opposing delegation understands, on a visceral level, exactly what kind of problem they are sitting across from. Every species we have ever delivered that statement to has spiked. The cortisol analog climbs. The cardiovascular rate climbs. The skin conductance index climbs. The shape of the spike varies by species and individual, but its presence is as reliable as anything we have measured in 2 centuries of this work. Coordinator Solis set her pen to the notebook and wrote something down. The array returned, baseline. I looked at it for a long moment. I told Varel to pull up the raw sensor feed and examine it directly for noise, drift, or hardware fault. She spent 9 minutes on it. She found nothing wrong. She looked at me and I nodded. and she quietly began the process of bringing the backup array online. Commander Voris moved to the second escalation point at 0708. This is what we call the timeline presentation, a formal document laying out the pace and structure of Conclave military decision-making, with specific reference to the window within which the human home system could expect to receive a resolution notice, one way or another. The document is honest. The timeline it presents is honest. That is the point. It is not a threat. It is simply a precise description of how quickly an outcome, any outcome, could be finalized. The emotional weight it produces in an opposing delegation is derived entirely from what an honest timeline, honestly laid out, implies. At 0711, the Erith observers in the back row of the hall requested a brief recess. Their own stress markers had spiked past our second threshold. We granted them 3 minutes. Coordinator Solis used the recess to refill her water glass from the carafe at the end of the table. The array, primary and backup both running now, returned the same numbers for both. Baseline. Baseline. She appeared to be reviewing a section of her notebook. She capped her pen, recapped it, set it parallel to the spine. When Voris resumed and continued with the timeline document, she listened, asked 2 clarifying questions about the orbital infrastructure assessment methodology, and made more notes. Varel said quietly, "Sir, should I flag the instrument suite for recalibration after the session? I'm running out of explanations." "It isn't the instrument suite," I said. "I want to be precise about when I understood that, too. It was somewhere between the second and third escalation points, around 0730, when I had been watching the readouts for over an hour and running out of technical reasons for what they were showing me. I had begun to consider a different possibility. There is a condition we have recorded in 14 species across our negotiation history. It is rare and it is treated, in our assessment files, as a significant threat indicator. It is a biological state in which an individual's fear response architecture has been sufficiently damaged, through trauma or neurological disruption, that they genuinely cannot register threat in the normal way. They are not suppressing fear. They simply do not have access to it. We call it threat dissociation, and it is considered dangerous in a negotiator because such an individual cannot be read, and a negotiator who cannot be read cannot be reliably predicted, and an unpredictable negotiator is a kind of instability the Conclave prefers not to encounter. What I was beginning to understand, looking at the array, was that I was not looking at a damaged individual. The rest of her biological profile was entirely coherent. Respiratory rate steady and normal. No signs of dissociative neurological markers. Cognitive indicators active and engaged. Her attention tracking precisely, her response times crisp, her hand movements deliberate. She was entirely present. She was listening to Voris describe the timeline within which her civilization could be concluded, and she was taking organized notes, and her body was telling our instruments that she was doing something no more threatening to her biology than a routine administrative meeting. She was not incapable of fear. Her species was not incapable of fear. I had pulled secondary files on human physiological documentation by then, and humans fear things. They fear things extensively. The literature on it is substantial. She simply was not afraid of this. I wrote a note and sent it directly to Adjudicator Sarel. I said, "I believe the instrument results are accurate. I believe she is fully cognitively present. I do not believe this is dissociation or damage. I believe this is baseline for this individual under these conditions, and I would like your authorization to escalate to Protocol 7. Protocol 7 is the third and final escalation point in our formal doctrine. It is not used often. It requires director authorization. It involves the direct, explicit presentation of individual outcome data, not aggregate, not systemic, but personal. A detailed, precise projection of what the resolution of the current situation means for the specific individual sitting across the table. Not their species. Them. It is the instrument we use when we believe an opposing negotiator has not yet understood, on a personal level, the weight of what they are sitting in. In 200 years, it has never failed to produce a measurable fear response. In some cases, it has produced responses significant enough to require a recess. Sarel authorized it at 0741. Voris delivered it at 0749. He was careful. He was thorough. He walked Coordinator Solis through the projection in precise, unhurried detail. He named her. He used the human convention of addressing someone by their individual designation rather than their role classification. He outlined, in specific terms, what the data suggested about the probability distribution of outcomes relevant to her, not as a threat, as a projection, as an honest account of what the available information implied. It took 11 minutes. The array ran through every sensitivity level we had. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. She looked at her notebook. She wrote something at the bottom of the page, and I could see her hand on the monitor feed, and the hand was not shaking. Then she said, "I understand the projection, Commander. I'd like to proceed." The array registered, at 0801, a single departure from baseline. One marker. Not cortisol. Not cardiovascular rate. Not conductance. The departure was in an index we use as a secondary correlate for a specific cognitive state, one we associate, in the species we have catalogued, with high-confidence forward planning, with the activation of long-term strategic attention. With a being that has, in that moment, moved past the question of whether an outcome is survivable and into the question of what comes next. I called Varel over and showed her. She looked at the index column and then at the clock stamp and said nothing for a moment. "Is that the planning index?" she said. "Yes." "During the Protocol 7 delivery?" "Yes." She was quiet again. I understood the silence. Protocol 7's entire design premise is that personalizing the existential stakes will force an opposing negotiator out of abstract strategic mode and into survival mode, that the biological calculus shifts, in that moment, from organizational to personal, and the fear response that follows is the most reliable signal we have that the other party has registered the full weight of what they are negotiating. We had delivered Protocol 7 to 41 delegations over the station's history. All 41 had spiked. This one had not spiked. This one had gone deeper into the planning register. We do not have a precise name for that index in our negotiation framework. We do not catalog it as a fear response because it is not one. It sits in an adjacent column in our instruments, one we do not typically watch during sessions because it has never before been the most active index in the room. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled the full session record back to 0625 and ran it again, looking for that index specifically, across every data point we had captured. It had been active since she sat down. The session concluded at 0914. The preliminary framework was initialed. The human envoy thanked Commander Voris by name, gathered her notebook, and left the hall at a pace that our motion analysis system described as unhurried. I filed the complete bioscience report at 1100. I included the raw instrument data, the calibration logs, the backup array crosschecks, and my own analysis of the anomalous index. I wrote, in the summary section, that the array had functioned correctly throughout the session and that the results it returned were accurate. I wrote that Coordinator Solis had shown no measurable fear response at any point during a session in which the formal agenda included the possible resolution of her species' continued existence. I wrote that this was not, in my assessment, a result of instrument failure, physiological anomaly, neurological damage, or deliberate pharmaceutical suppression. I wrote that what the array had found, and what it had been registering since 0625, was something our instrument suite did not have a category for. A state that sits adjacent to dread but is not dread. A state that activates, apparently, when a human being sits down at the table where the worst possible outcome is formally on offer, and decides, before the first word is spoken, that the outcome is not the most important thing in the room. I wrote that I was recommending a formal review of our negotiation doctrine's foundational assumption. The assumption that all sentient species fear death in a way that is measurable, exploitable, and ultimately predictive of behavior. I also included a note from the hall, relayed by one of the session support staff after the envoy had left. They had been clearing the table when they noticed her notebook was still open to the last page she had written on. They had not read it, standard protocol, but they had photographed it for the record, in case it contained session-relevant material. It did not contain session-relevant material. At the bottom of the page, below her session notes, she had written 4 words. Our translation staff rendered them 2 hours later. The words were, "We've done this before." Adjudicator Sarel read my report that evening. He sent one line back. Upgrade the threat classification. Unlock the full review.